Paul Kagame of Rwanda. President Kagame has been serving in this capacity since the year 2000. He's a central figure in the country's modern history and is credited with leading Rwanda's recovery from the 1994 genocide, transforming it into one of Africa's most stable and economically dynamic countries. He's a strong advocate for African solutions for African problems. Under his leadership, electrification and broadband access in Rwanda have expanded at one of the fastest rates worldwide, with an emphasis on public-private partnership. Today, data privacy, digital adoption, cybersecurity feature prominently in Rwanda's policy making, as they are in developed nations. President Kagame has been highly strategic in shaping Rwanda's geopolitical and global trade priorities. He was chairperson of Africa Union in the year 2018 and is a vocal advocate of the African Continental Free Trade Area. Rwanda is also among the top contributors to peacekeeping forces globally. He's against protectionism and trade barriers. Rwanda's effective handling of the pandemic and hosting Africa's very first messenger RNA vaccine production facility has enhanced its reputation globally. Rwanda's remarkable success has been characterized by rapid economic growth, political stability, and significant improvement in the quality of life for its citizens. To unpack the key ingredients of this miracle in the making, will you please welcome onto stage, of course, already is, President Paul Kagame, and moderating this wonderful dialogue to come is CEO of Milken Institute, Richard DiTizio. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robin. Thank you all for coming, and Your Excellency, thank you for being here. I want to start with Rwanda's role on the African continent and the world stage. Rwanda was recently ranked #1 in continental Africa on the Ease of Doing Business Index, a remarkable rise of over 120 spots up that ranking. What do you think 2 or 3 of the most important factors have been in Rwanda's ascendancy as a place to do business? And which roadblocks did you think were most important to remove in order to have that breakthrough?
Well, first, we have had a tragic history. Rwanda has had that, but we have left that behind us, and for us to be moving forward successfully, we had to make choices, policy choices, if you will. But it starts with mobilizing everybody in the country to understand why some of those choices are the ones we have to adopt. And one of the things we had to do was to look at, things can't just be addressed by politics. Politics is a very good thing, but in as far as politics allows the right environment for other things to happen. And that's how we came to embrace doing business and attracting investment and things are all around that. And therefore we had to figure out how best can we attract investments to our country and allow our own citizens to thrive off of that and do businesses as they should. And we came down to a couple of things. In doing business, how do you do it less costly? We created an environment in which people can invest, do business comfortably, securely, and so on and so forth. And that has also to connect with the market, the wider market. And one of the things we considered was, how do we allow freedom of movement, not only within the country, of course, but even more importantly, across the region and our continent. But how, on the first one, how do people who come in to invest from outside, how do they repatriate their dividends, if I have to? But overall, there has to be clear governance that allows stability so that people doing business don't have to worry about many other things that have nothing to do with actually doing business. So the constraints, of course, have been the fact that previously we have had in our country a long history of sort of dysfunction and country divided, and so we had to get people used to this and to understand it, to be part of it, that we can create a new environment that everybody could come together to benefit from. So these are some of the things we considered.
So one thing that's also been remarkable in the success of Rwanda has been the speed of electrification. So I was just looking, in 2009, only 6% of Rwandans had households that access to electricity consistently. And this year, that number has risen to 75% of all Rwandan households. How did you do that, and how did you fund it in order to have that happen so quickly?
Well, one thing leads to another once you've got started on the right footing. Of course, government invests in that. We invest in other things, but we prioritize infrastructure, energy infrastructure for that matter, technology and many other things, and invest in the development of skills of our population and so on and so forth. So in all this, we found energy infrastructure is very important. It enables everything else to happen. Businesses need energy of all kinds. That technology you're talking about requires energy and so on and so forth. So the financing of that came from government, from partners. We have partners in development who have asked us to indicate our priorities. And this has attracted a lot of investments in the sense that because of what we earlier talked about, we have created a predictable environment. When people put their money in Rwanda, the expected returns actually happen, and then sometimes even exceed what people were expecting. So that attracts more partnership and more flow of investments from these partners, but we also take it, and we have seen that it benefits everyone, and in fact, those investments have been useful, but also the returns are very good.
And the scale of that investment is also astonishing. So Rwanda has increased more than 50 times what FDI used to be into the country. Give us your thoughts, because the government can't do everything. So give us your thoughts on how you think about partnering with the private sector on things like digitization, broadband for Rwanda's future.
Yes, government can't do much really. It's not everything, but it can't even do much. So that's why the private partnership and engagement is absolutely necessary. And let me, in fact, by this also invite the friends and colleagues here in the audience to look at what they can do in Rwanda or beyond across our continent. To begin with, let me give you a couple of partnerships we have had with the businesses, even starting with from here in Singapore. We have notable, let's say, two companies. One called Crimson Logic, which has partnered with our country and created a platform called Irembo, a digital platform on which different services are delivered to the citizens and others beyond. So they brought in the know-how, the technology, we patterned, both sides provided what the capital was needed, and we've really made very good and significant progress. Another one is called Sobana Jurong, which has partnered with our country to draw a master plan for the development of our city, the capital, Kigali. And they are now involved in building Kigali Innovation City. So these are the very significant things that private entities can do best, and especially even more when they partner with the government that is interested. And we have partnered with many other groups to develop Kigali International Financial Center, which is developing quite well. So, and more people, because of that background, the stability, the rule of law, the predictable environment, the ease of doing business that you just mentioned, have been capitalized to attract more people to come and invest in Rwanda and work with us, and work with, even through Rwanda, to other parts of our continent.
So let me stay on something you just mentioned, the rule of law. So the rule of law has been such an important factor of the success realized here in Singapore and around the globe. Yet in some countries today, the judiciary is under attack or its impartiality is being questioned. How has the system worked in Rwanda? And what can other countries take from your example?
Well, for us, we learn a lot from our history, from other people, from different experiences. Obviously and inevitably, there are all kinds of problems across the world. We try and shape our own world in Rwanda, bearing in mind and trying to learn from those mistakes that are made across the world. So we make sure we insist on stabilizing our situation and openly and freely engaging with the rest of the world. And based on the choices we have made, I pointed to earlier, we tend to concentrate on what is likely to work for us, and if there are other people who have like minds who can work together, so that if they think what we are doing benefits them, then we go along and work with them. And if we find that other things are working well elsewhere, and we can learn from that, we don't hesitate to ask to work with those people, sort of things. But otherwise, if you wanted to look at the problems across the world, you just lose yourself in that. And so we tend to concentrate on what we have to do in our country. We look beyond and see what we can learn from that. And in the process also learn to navigate through these complexities that the world provides, and that in itself has its own lessons to learn from.
Okay, I want to pivot a little bit. As you know, one of the pillars that we work on at the Milken Institute is health broadly. So Rwanda had set a goal of universal health coverage in 1999, and today has the highest health insurance coverage across the continent of Africa. Tell us, what were some of the innovations that were necessary to affect that, and how do you see the future of ongoing health coverage in the country?
And by the way, some of these good things you are referring to again, based on the choices we have made and how accountable we hold ourselves and each other, don't happen at a very high cost, we find, in fact. But it's about tapping into every individual's possibilities and involvement. This is what we do. For example, we have people in the health sector who more or less work voluntarily to a tune of now between 50 and 60,000 people across the country who are involved as healthcare givers after minimum training, and they help people in the rural areas and on some of the things they can handle. But we have also invested in the healthcare, the system in our country, from high levels to lower levels of districts, including the remotest rural areas. We provide services, health services in that area and in those areas, and the very people I've just talked about are involved and they make things happen. So it's about being very practical for some of the things you have decided to do and involving people who, first of all, understand the benefits, even that accrue to them, and then having been mobilized and they do things with the desire to actually succeed. So the healthcare system has been working very well. We even saw it during the COVID pandemic when it happened. We took care of that, and much as it was affecting us, it affected our economy and so many things. But we minimized the loss of life, and because of the organization and the involvement of everybody to participate. And in fact, if you look at for the last 30 years, life expectancy also has increased. We remember from, slightly over 30 years, it was about 40. Now it has risen, average is 70. So in just that period, that shows the pathway we have followed in engaging everybody and doing whatever we can within our means.
So I'd like to get some of your insights on how you think about governance and government in Rwanda. So Rwanda is recognized as a leader in gender equality and women's empowerment. Just to contrast the two, over 60% of the parliament in Rwanda are women, compared to, say, my country, the United States, where only 28% of the House of Representatives are women and 25% of the Senate. In fact, the House of Representatives in the United States didn't even have a ladies' room until 2011. So how did you get to such a gender parity and beyond in Rwanda, and why is that important as you think about the future stability of the country?
Well, we've been realistic from the beginning. And when we are looking at our people, the whole population, we are looking at everybody, irrespective of their gender. Not only numbers, but also in terms of rights. So that's how we look at it, whether it is education, whether it is access to whatever we want our people to have access to. We are looking at everybody. We are not looking at the gender or any other background that creates a divide. We have had enough of the divide in our history, and you are aware of even the tragic part of that. So we learned our lessons to make sure that we increasingly bring our people together, irrespective of their backgrounds or even gender, and that's where it stems from. So women in Rwanda have access now to education as much as their male counterparts. This was not the case before. And we have also reaped the benefits of that. We've seen it. In fact, our population is 52%, nearly 52% of our population are women. So I don't know how intelligent any person would be to exclude over 50% of your population. It doesn't require much logic to understand that you don't have to do that. So we've really meant to do that, and we are seeing it. So governance is an issue of rights, is an issue of accountability. You avoid some of the things that you know anyway are going to undermine you, like in the case of governance. We fight corruption because we realized a lot of resources that would have gone into health or food security or education or, end up in few people's hands unfairly. So we've created an environment where people who get involved in that will understand it's not a good thing to be involved in, especially when you are caught. So that is, it's important, it's justice, it's an issue of rights, it's beneficial to everyone. So we take this seriously, and fortunately, by the way, our population, 35 years and below, are 74%. So these are young people mainly. So we've made sure that as they grow up and take these responsibilities, they really come from this background and understand issues of accountability and governance, and then the benefits that accrue to that.
So I'm sure most people here are aware of the history and tragedy in 1994, Rwanda. How did that change you as a person, looking back 30 years now? And how does it change you as a leader today?
Well, it's very broad, but let me say one thing. Rwanda has gone through many difficulties, and at a personal level, by the way, my family we became refugees when I was 4 years old, and stayed in a refugee camp for slightly over 2 decades. The lesson that comes from that, then later on, of course, the history, lessons of our own tragic 1994 genocide. Because of the division that was there, that people should do. But the reasons, the lessons from that, and which shaped me or informed me, and many others. It's not just me. There are many others. In a situation like that, every individual, in a way, you have to make personal, even or informed decisions. Either you give up and break, and that's the end of you, or you make the choice of saying, I'm going to stand up to this. I'm going to give it a fight that I have in me to survive and maybe to make progress. So at a personal level, that happened. So at some point, and I know it's not just me, it's many in our country, we are faced with individual choices. Do you give up and die? Or do you die fighting? And those of us who made the choice of the latter, that's how these choices. So, today I'm president. I never even lived or fought to be president. It just happened actually because of, and when it came, I embraced it. But it's not what I was fighting for. In our struggle, I was fighting for my rights to my country. I was asking myself questions, and that's what many other Rwandans, girls and boys, men and women, are asking themselves, those who stood up and fought for that. So later on, when you are in a place like mine and you have responsibility, again, it helps to keep reflecting. Would you be the same person to make the same mistakes that people made that made you a refugee or led to loss of lives of so many and so on and so forth. Or you really want to do your best, humanly possible, to feel satisfied that you are doing the right thing for yourself, but also putting yourself in the shoes of many others. Are they able to stand up to these challenges the way it should happen, and maybe the challenges should be minimized as much as possible? It's what goes on in the minds, at least it does in my mind, whenever I'm going about my responsibilities. I'm a good student of history.
So the median age of the population of Rwanda is just below 20, which means more than half of the people weren't even alive in 1994. What is your greatest hope for them and the future of Rwanda?
My hope is that the investments they have made and the country has made in them will prepare them to a better future and better lives than those of us of our age have lived. And of course, every day we talk to them, we have conversations, we always tell them nothing to be taken for granted. They have really to think about what they want to achieve, what they want to, but I'm looking at the progress being made. I think there's a bright future, and we wish prosperity to all our people. And looking at the progress made year in, year out, I think it is achievable, much as it is easy to destroy. Human beings, when they, in our case, our history really gives two lessons. One is what human beings can do that is terrible, including self-destruction. But also there is another side when we recover from all this, that human beings actually have in them the better side that can also move them to a good future that they actually deserve. So we for us in Rwanda, we are between these two things. And as much as we can embrace the second one, which works towards prosperity, so much the better. And I think the young people today whom we talk to every time, and invest in even as a country, we hope they can learn a lasting lesson from all this.
Well, Your Excellency, we are out of time, but I want to thank you for your example of leadership and thank you for being with us today.
Appreciate it.